Hey everyone, Delve here. Today I'm pleased to bring you a guide for blunt weapons in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. Now, blunt is, as you might expect, relatively similar to blade in terms of how it functions. So this video could very easily be more or less a repetition of the blade guide, as in we could play as a red guard and just go to the Shivering Isles to stack various greater powers. And that wouldn't be a bad way of doing things. But instead, we're going to focus on using the game's various support magic to assist us along the way instead. Now, to be upfront, this guide is just as much an illusion guide as it is a blunt guide, but there will still be plenty of scenarios where blunt weapons will at least be usable, and most of our damage won't really be coming from illusion anyway, at least in some scenarios, so it makes sense. Also, just like blade weapons, blunt weapons simply aren't really usable past low levels, so a fairly crucial component of this character is that we remain low level. This will also make our spellcasting easier to use as well, so we will have to stay low level to get the maximum effect out of our spellcasting, at least in the short term. With that being said, we will still briefly discuss leveling up at the end, and of course to beat the game we have to be at least level 2. For our race, probably the best option is the Breton. This race is one of the better races for spellcasting and may in fact be the strongest race in the game overall. They have a greater power which grants 50 shield for 60 seconds, which means it's very easy to reach the 85 armor cap. More importantly, they start with 50 bonus magicka. This is extremely useful for any character making use of magic, to the point where it's almost necessary, as many very powerful spells cost about that much magicka. And then of course they also start with 50% resistance to magic, which is extremely overpowered and means it's relatively easy to hit the magic resistance cap with this character. Hitting this cap will mean that we are immune to negative spells, which is as useful as it sounds and is something we will be relying on for the end of the game. Now, for any character who plans to use restoration magic, you want to do yourself a favor in the tutorial and start spamming it right out of the gate, because it's one of the more difficult magic schools to level. Similarly, any magic-oriented character should get used to spamming low-cost spells, as it's a really crucial way of increasing your skills. And spells can be cast more quickly by holding down the block button while holding down the spellcast key. You'll cast the spell slightly quicker that way. For the tutorial, Breton is a decent enough race, more able to handle the rats than most of the other races on account of the shield power. They still have damage problems early on, just like a lot of other races, and blunt is also worse than blade in the tutorial. Even the first two rats are pretty brutal. I beat them by using Renault's katana and getting them stuck on the terrain, and you kind of have to cheese it that way. There's no other way to deal with them. But for the rest of the rats, you can kill them by cheesing the fact they can't transition between areas. So you just lure the rats to the door, beat on them, and then when you're about to die, just go through it and heal up. And then once you have full health, you can just go back to the door again and kill them. This is a nice way to level up some of your basic skills, so not a bad idea to do in the tutorial. Now for your star sign, I recommend the Mage. This is another 50 points of magicka, which will give us even more leeway to cast spells. For the class, I went with another custom class here I called Paladin. For specialization, the choice here is either combat or magic. Magic itself is going to be more useful, but I actually went combat since combat skills like blunt armor and block are really tough to level up in this game. Compare that to magic, which is actually pretty easy to level up even if your specialization isn't magic. For favorite attributes, I went with intelligence for more magicka and endurance for more health, as Bretons are fairly fragile. Willpower and strength are also probably good options here as well. For skills, I went with alteration, armor, block, blunt, conjuration, illusion, and restoration. We won't really need armor skills because we're a Breton, and even block will be kind of useless in the long run, so swap those out if you want. But the magic schools are essentially required. Okay, once you get out of the tutorial, it's time to start leveling magic. But of course, we'll need to make gold to be required to buy spells in the first place. The easiest way to make gold without duping items is to join the Mages Guild and take all the alchemy tools, and then sell them to the alchemy vendors. Make sure to check the cabinets, as they also contain alchemy tools. And then once you've drained all the guild halls and sold off all the alchemy supplies, you can wait outside them for a few days and all the cabinets will have restocked, making them sources of infinite gold. You can also get a free 1,000 gold just by doing Glarthir's quest in Skingrad, as well as a free fame point by turning him in to the guards at the end of the quest. Now that we know how to make unlimited gold, it's time to talk about the schools of magic we're going to use. We'll start with Conjuration. Obviously, Conjuration is a school of magic associated with summons, which we'll disregard for now. That's a topic worthy of its own entire video. Instead, we'll explore the other two things that Conjuration can do for us, specifically conjured weapons and armor. These last a painfully short duration of only 15 seconds, but there's a glitch that can be used to make them last forever. What you do is you summon one, use it to kill a low-level enemy like a mud crab, repair it, drop it, wait for 1 hour, and then pick it back up, and now you have a 0 weight endgame weapon. Now, you might justifiably point out that this is kind of an exploit, obviously a non-intended glitch. However, remember that we can easily gain access to the Umbra sword just by doing the Umbra trick, so this is the only advantage that blunt weapons have over blades. We could of course also get a claymore or dagger using this trick, but I also think that the Daedric Mace is in a good middle ground as far as weapons go, only requiring 50 Conjuration skill and having decent reach and attack speed. Now, while the damage of these Daedric Maces is lower than the Umbra sword, these maces come unenchanted, and so can be repaired before reaching 50 armor or skill, so they're a decent option. If that's too much of a cheat for you, you can go for a Silver Mace instead, but in typical blunt fashion, it's a bit tougher to get your hands on a Silver Mace over a Silver Longsword. The only location I know of that's guaranteed to have a Silver Mace is in the basement of the Copious Coin Purse in the Imperial City. You can break in during the night and steal it, but to remove the stolen tag, you'll have to join the Thieves Guild and launder it via Fence and Bruma. Even with this, you will still pretty much want the Daedric Mace ready to go, since having a lower damage weapon will really just be an inconvenience, although I am certain you could make it work if you really wanted to avoid cheating. With all that being said, I think that the Daedric Mace is interesting to talk about just because it goes to show that blunt weapons simply aren't as good as blades, at least for max difficulty. Once that's out of the way, we can talk about the other spell that Conjuration has, that being Turn Undead. This causes undead enemies like zombies to flee from you, and there are plenty of situations where this can pay off. Depending on the enemy and the layout of the dungeon, enemies will sometimes get stuck in corners, so you can hit them without fear of reprisal as long as you keep casting the spell over and over again. One great example would be Bleak Flat's Cave during the quest to rescue Earthor. Ordinarily, zombies are some of the more annoying enemies in the game, but with a Daedric Mace and a simple Turn Undead spell, they actually become fairly manageable with really little effort. You can also use it against skeleton enemies as well. The main trick is that you get 3 attacks before the enemy turns back around to attack. This is a little tedious to do, but at the bare minimum it can buy you a little space to heal up or something, and you may not end up having a better option against some enemies, as these Turn Undead spells are extremely mana efficient and can be used to neutralize enemies more or less indefinitely. Next, I'll talk about Alteration. The most obvious use for this school of magic is shield effects, which can be used to get you close to the armor cap of 85 with or without armor. For Breton in particular, you can stack these shield spells with Dragon Skin to get to the 85 armor cap, meaning you essentially don't need armor at all, or at least very little. To be honest, this really isn't that useful, but I did use it a decent number of times to win a fight here or there, so it's definitely not completely useless. There's also the elemental shield effects, which come in either the fire, frost, or shock shield variety. The problem with these is that they only give you defense to a single magical element at a time, and are more expensive than regular shield effects, making them dubiously useful. You also have feather and unlock effects. These are self-explanatory, although they don't really do that much to help you in combat. Your equip load does have some kind of effect on your move speed, so feather will do that for you at least, and I did use a basic feather spell somewhat often whenever I went over the equip load cap. It's a pretty cheap effect. I also used the guard spell, which is 30 points of shield for 30 seconds. Alongside Dragon Skin and a small amount of armor, or a 5% shield effect, you can reach an extremely powerful 85% shield, which is about as close as you can get to immunity to physical attacks. The Alteration skill is also really easy to level up, so it's not much of an opportunity cost to level it up at least a little bit, and I got it to about 50. Next, I'll talk about Restoration. This is largely exactly what you think it is. Good for casting healing spells and not much else, and also very difficult to level up. With that being said, casting a fear spell on an enemy and then healing myself was something I did a decent number of times, and was fairly useful in the long run, and so I consider it fairly useful, and I never needed a spell better than the basic 25-point healing spell. You can also get magic resistant effects through Restoration as well, but these are simply too expensive to ever really be useful in my opinion. It makes much more sense to have equipment enchanted with magic resistance, and the same principle applies to Spell Absorption and Spell Reflect, which can be obtained via the Mysticism School of Magic. All of these are good effects from Sigil Stone enchantments and not from spells. And for our last and most important school of support magic, we have Illusion. This is probably the best skill in Oblivion, with the only meaningful downside being that you cannot use it to directly attack enemies, so you will have to combine it with other skills at some point. Even so, it's insanely powerful and is very close to being good enough to beat the game with on its own. You want to bring this to 100, which is fairly easy to do actually. Just continuously cast a basic light spell while you're walking around. Now, we'll start with the biggest thing it has going for it, which is invisibility. This is a comedically powerful effect and can be used to easily ignore huge numbers of enemies, and it's not even that expensive either, so it's easy to use as a get out of jail free card in any number of scenarios. You can buy a 30-second invisibility spell in the Bravo Mages Guild, and it's the only invisibility spell you'll ever need, as you can always just cast it again to stay invisible forever. However, whenever you do act, which includes hitting switches, casting spells, attacking, or even drinking potions, this effect does break, so you aren't strictly invincible just because you're invisible. Enemies will sometimes still target you anyway in a seemingly bugged fashion, so be aware that it's only mostly foolproof, not completely, and you may take a stray arrow here or there depending on the circumstances. Next up are the command effects, specifically command humanoid and command creature. These can be easily used to mind control enemies, and it's exactly as useful as you think it is. The overwhelming majority of enemies are vulnerable to one or the other of these two effects, including most Daedra, creatures, undead, and humanoids. These spells, alongside most other illusion spells, have a level range which determines which enemies they can affect, which is another good reason to stay low level so that you can mind control more enemies. Obviously, the higher level an enemy is, the more it costs to mind control them, so that's less than ideal, assuming you plan to level up. Note that this spell can have very awkward interactions with allied NPCs, as mind controlled enemies will often get into fights with them. So you will often be blamed if a guard or ally dies this way, so be aware it's not ideal in most scenarios involving NPC allies. Level 9 versions of these spells that last for 30 seconds can be bought from Athragar in the Coral Mages Guild, and they're some of the best spells in the game, assuming you stay low level. Now the next illusion effect is Demoralize. This is roughly the same as Turn Undead, except that it affects most enemies not affected by Turn Undead, including vampires, Daedra, etc., NPCs. Just like Turn Undead, it can be occasionally useful, although it's not actually that much cheaper than the command spells, so I wouldn't necessarily try to rely on this. And the last useful illusion effect is Paralyze. This is obviously an extremely powerful effect, allowing you to stun lock enemies to death. Note that the duration is affected by how much armor you have, but either way, with a good amount of magicka, you should be able to easily kill most low-level enemies by chain casting it and hitting them with a mace. Some enemies are also immune to this effect, including skeletons and vampires, although most of the enemy types immune to it are higher level enemies, such as Storm Atronax and Spider Daedra, so it won't really affect your ability to beat the game. Note that undead like ghosts and zombies aren't immune to paralysis, just skeletons it seems like. So for example, the Wraith boss in the Knights of the Nine questline was easy to paralyze to death, and I also use it against the Circle of Ghosts in the Knights of the Nine questline as well. Without that, it would have been a lot tougher to do. Now, there are a handful of other illusion effects, such as Calm, Charm, and Fury, but I think these aren't quite as useful against most enemies. These are really more tools for affecting NPCs in the towns and cities. Silence is another one that potentially can be useful against enemies who heal themselves, although it's unfortunately an expensive effect, so I think it's rarely, if ever, worth trying to use on enemies, rather than command or paralysis. Okay, so your interaction with most enemies and areas will ultimately go something like this. You approach enemies while invisible, and then you mind control one of them and have them all kill each other. And then once there's only a single enemy left, you chain paralysis him to death. And if you need more mana, you can just drink potions, or go invisible and wait for your mana to recharge. For enemies this doesn't work against. Some of these can be beaten by maxing out your armor with shield spells and fighting them in melee, retreating and using healing spells if necessary. Another option would be to use a Fear of Command effect and then attack them 3 times, after which they'll start attacking you again and you'll have to recast the spell. This is pretty tedious. Fortunately, it's pretty rare that there aren't other enemies around to mind control, so you won't really have to do this very often. In the main questline, for example, the only time I had to do this was against the Undead Blades and Sancretor, who obviously cannot be paralyzed. Another set of potentially annoying enemies would be vampires, who are unpredictable and immune to paralysis. Fortunately, you don't really have to fight so many of those, depending on what quests you are choosing to do. Before we talk about the final boss, it's really important to discuss Sigil Stones and magic resistance. These are really good for a Breton character, since magic resistance is one of the best effects in the game. The level 1 and 2 Sigil Stones only grant 5% magic resistance, but you can also get the Gates of Aetherius power from the Aetherius Stone, northwest of Skingrad. This grants you an easy 20% magic resist for 120 seconds, once per day, meaning that you'll only need to hit 80% magic resistance to hit 100% magic resistance with the power active. You will of course need 20 combined fame or infamy points to get this power, so I do recommend doing some basic quests. I went with the Knights of the Nine quest line, which I completed, along with some of the basic Mages Guild quests so that I could get into the Arcane University later. Now in most cases you will not need 100%. 80% to 90% is good enough in many scenarios, but it's nice against many otherwise dangerous enemies, the best example being Mankar Cameron. You won't be able to kill him with a mace, it's simply not possible, so to kill him you'll want to use the command humanoid spells to mind control his children and summons. This is one scenario where you actually don't want to go invisible while fighting him. You want to have really high magic resistance. This is so he wastes all of his magicka trying to cast spells at you, which prevents him from either killing his children or healing himself, and this is obviously much easier if you have really high magic resistance. Another option would be to use a silence poison on him, as they have a much longer duration than silence spells, and cannot be absorbed or reflected. There's one guaranteed 30-second silence poison that can be bought from Shady Sam outside the Imperial City north of the stables. Next we'll talk about leveling up. This character can level up, but just like the Blade character, the usefulness of the blunt skill grows progressively more useless as we level up. Additionally, we're basically guaranteed to need custom spells to keep our strategy going, so you'll probably want to gain access to the Arcane University. Not so much for invisibility or paralysis, but definitely for command effects. 25 points of command is enough to command almost any creature or humanoid, but only assuming you have no armor equipped, as your spell effectiveness score affects what level of enemies you can or cannot mind control. In short, you will essentially need to have no armor on to make full use of your command spells. Duration doesn't matter too much, just because enemies that have started to attack each other won't stop, even if the spell duration of the command spell wears off. Although my custom spells had 10 seconds attached to them, just so I could lure enemies into each other more easily. For most alone enemies, you can of course still chain paralyze them and beat them down with your mace, although as you level up, more enemies will appear which have spell absorption, reflection, and immunity to paralysis, so it pays to have maxed out magic resistance in those cases. You can of course also enchant your mace with a Sigil Stone enchantment to get a little tiny bit of extra damage, but honestly it's barely even worth doing. I do want to say though that by level 20 the age of the mace is past and they're not going to be that useful no matter what you do, unless you're doing custom enchantments. Additionally, you'll probably need more magicka to cast enough paralysis spells or control spells. More magicka can easily be obtained from Sigil Stones, with the highest level Sigil Stones granting a whopping 50 magicka to any piece of clothing, jewelry, or armor. So you will want those magicka boosting Sigil Stones if you plan to keep playing, after you have your magic resistance squared away at least. The question you may have then is how to deal with enemies that are high level, immune to paralysis, damage reflection, and that have no nearby enemies to command. These include Storm Atronachs, Clanfear, Spider Daedra, and vampires. Now, most of the time you simply won't have to kill them, you can just invisibility past them, but there are some situations where you will in fact have to kill them for a quest. A great example to this would be the last vampire during Azura's Daedra quest. You can get most of the vampires to just fight each other to death, but then there's always that last vampire you have to deal with, and there are probably some other quests out there in the game with this kind of issue. One trick you can use to contend with these scenarios is follower NPCs, but these have their limitations and so must be well understood. First off, this game was not really designed around followers, unlike Skyrim. The second thing is that most NPC followers aren't essential, and the ones that are tend to be tied to certain quests and tend to scale badly with level anyway. Earthor being the prime example, he's fine enough for a low-level character, but not really good enough at high levels, and you also can't get into the Arcane University as long as you are using him, so I think he really just gets in the way most of the time. Also, there are some areas followers cannot be brought into. They simply cannot follow you into places like Paradise at the end of the game, or, like the Umarilla Unfeathered fight at the end of the Knights of the Nine questline. That's another great example. Command and Paralyze effects are good enough for these scenarios, but that's another limitation that they have. With that being said, the generic NPC followers are actually fairly decent since they come with scaled weapons, although you will have to do certain questlines to get access to most of them. The one I used came from the Knights of the Nine Priory, but you can gain access to the Battlehorn Men-at-Arms with very little effort just by killing the bandits in front of the castle, although you will need the Battlehorn Castle DLC to get access to that. The main trick to using them is to heal and buff them as they fight, otherwise they won't last very long. Custom healing and alteration spells are good options, but I just used the healing and shielding lesser powers that came with the gauntlets and greaves of the Crusader, armor pieces tied to the Knights of the Nine questline. The crippling flaw with using followers is that their weapons and armors will inevitably break, rendering them much weaker if not useless. There's no way to repair them, so they're essentially worthless for killing more than a handful of enemies, which is exactly why I recommend using them only when absolutely necessary. When their equipment does break, you can then just let them die and then wait a few days and they'll respawn with new equipment, and that's a good enough solution. So, not really a huge fan of followers, but in some niche scenarios they can definitely be useful. Okay, and that's basically everything covering the blunt skill with the game's support magic. And it really goes to show how and why magic tends to steal the show in this game. It's more than enough to beat the game with, and pretty fun as long as you stay low level. You just need the mace to kill a handful of enemies here and there. Ultimately, leveling up is pretty tedious as this character. It's not bad or anything, but it does become very clear that you're just going to invisibility past everything, And then whenever you have to kill something, you just make all his allies fight him. And, you know, it's okay, but I'm not that crazy about leveling up. I think staying low level is a lot more fun. Lastly, I'd like to thank the other Oblivion YouTubers, many of whom I learned various tricks from, those being a Kiss Hairseg, Schneller Herring, and the Old Knight. Highly recommend their YouTube channels, as well as the UESP and fandom wikis. Combined, these are great sources of information, and I couldn't have done it without all of them. And thanks for watching.